So Katie, I'll hand over to you to tell us all about Farmerama and your experience with that.
Sure, thank you, Kashka. So the first thing I'm going to say, which maybe I shouldn't say, is I slept really badly last night and I'm really tired. So I'm hoping I don't sort of grind to a halt at some point. But if I do, hopefully I'll find my thread again. Also, if you have any questions, feel free to jump in, but I think afterwards there'll be a chance as well to have a bit of a discussion. But yeah, my name's Katie. As Kashka said, I'm going to be talking a little bit about a podcast called Farmerama, which I've been involved with for, I think, around about 4 years. Maybe first of all, actually, just to explain, in very basic terms, what a podcast is. So definitely there are podcasts that are radio programs available to listen to at other times. But then there are a huge number of podcasts that exist as kind of standalone entities as well. And I think one of the reasons for that is that relative to other media, I would say the sort of barriers to entry are quite low. It is actually possible to make and publish a podcast relatively easily, which I think has a lot of benefits, possibly some drawbacks as well. But yeah, so that's very basically what a podcast is and what Farmerama is. A little bit more detail about Farmerama. Our sort of strapline is that we are an award-winning podcast sharing the voices behind regenerative farming. The regenerative farming bit, in a way, actually is a bit reductive. We cover, I would say, a much wider range of stories than just that. You could use terms like agroecological, small scale, perhaps. We cover some permaculture related stories, but it's all broadly speaking in the sort of sustainable farming world. And yeah, increasingly as well, I'd say that we're sort of stepping back from the nitty gritty of the farming itself and trying to explore the wider context as well. So more about the social, the economic and the political backdrop to the farming, the food production that's going on. Our primary audience, I would say, is farmers and food producers themselves. That was always sort of the core focus of the podcast. But we definitely have a listenership that goes beyond that. A lot of people that listen are just interested. Some people are keen to get into farming or into growing. Some people maybe do a little bit, but have a different day job. So it's a pretty broad listenership, I would say. And actually, the bulk of our listeners are in urban areas rather than in rural areas, to the extent that you can find that out. Podcasting statistics are notoriously difficult to interpret, but that seems to be the case. So the podcast started around about 5 years ago, and the people who started it were Joe, who's an audio producer, Abby, who does many different things, but the main thing she does is she creates apps for small scale farmers, and Nigel, who is himself a farmer. So they, I think, all ran into each other at a conference, got talking, decided that a podcast would be a good way to reach farmers. So I wasn't involved right at the start. I got involved, I think, about a year after Farmerama had started, simply by sending them an email. I came across them online. I was looking for experience in audio production. I've been interested in food and in farming for a long time, so it seemed like a good combination. And yeah, I just dropped them a line and asked if I could help. So now the core production team consists of 3 of us. Nigel has since dropped out. He's focusing on the actual farming. But the core production team is Joe, who's based between Reading and Canada at the moment, Abby, who lives in London and also in Chile for part of the year, and myself, I am just in Glasgow, don't have a second location. Joe and I are the audio producers, so we do the sort of hands-on production, the editing and the mixing. Abby, I would say, is a real kind of all-rounder. She tends to be the one who comes up with ideas for stories to cover, series to develop. And she's also very good at developing partnerships, finding ways to collaborate with other people, other organizations. She's very good at the networking side of things. And also through the work that she does the rest of the time, she's constantly in communication with farmers and with related organizations. So yeah, a lot of the ideas come from her. And then we all get involved with planning both the monthly episodes and the special series that we do. We all contribute to recording the actual audio. That's something Abby does as well, even though she doesn't do the editing. We all feed back on each other's edits. So listening through and suggesting bits to cut, bits to move around, bits that need to be clarified. And then also when it comes to things like funding proposals, that's something we all contribute to as well. So we're all doing a mix of different things, I would say, which I think is pretty typical with podcasts, and especially with small projects, small podcasts like this. We do also have a wider team. So these are people who on an occasional basis will help out with social media, with doing project management if we have series that we're producing. We do also have someone doing PR, which I still find a bit strange. But yeah, she's been really helpful at helping spread the word, and I think has helped us reach a wider audience than we would have done otherwise. That is a photograph of the three of us, me, Abby, and Joe. Don't know the name of the guy on the right, but that was earlier this year. It's the first time we'd actually met in person for quite a long time. So a little bit about the monthly episodes. This is really how Farmerama started, was as a monthly podcast. And the format is what I would describe as a magazine format. So around 2 to 4 stories per episode, and they don't have any connection to each other. It's really a sort of grab bag of different stories with some narration explaining them in between. And they tend to be pretty straightforward interviews. It's pretty rare that we have more sort of edited pieces in there. And yeah, the original idea was really that these would be a means for farmers or growers to share experiences between themselves, share advice, share tips for ways of doing things, really based on the reality that as a farmer, you have a very limited number of opportunities to actually take risks or to try things out. You know, it's once a year at most that you can do something new. And then it takes a year to find out if it's worked and to tweak things. So the idea is that by allowing farmers to share through the podcast, that can potentially speed up the rate of change, give people ideas they might not have come across otherwise, and also give people the confidence to try things out, knowing that someone else has already done it, basically. And at the bottom, those are just some examples of the titles of monthly episodes, just to give you a bit of an idea of the kind of things we cover in any one episode. And then a few years ago, we also started making series. So these are quite different to the monthly episodes. And we've done 3 so far. The first one we called Serial. If there's anyone who is a regular podcast listener, you might get the joke. There was a hit podcast, true crime podcast called Serial, S-E-R-I-A-L. So that was a bit of a nod to that. We did another one last year called Who Feeds Us? And then this year we had a series called Landed. And we have another series which is just going into production called Cultivating Justice, which will be out next year. And that's a collaboration with an organization called Lion, Land in Our Names, and also the Land Workers Alliance LGBTQAI+ working group. So very broadly speaking, looking to share stories and voices from people who are generally kind of underrepresented in farming and in growing. So they're all very, very different, those series, both in terms of the themes, the content, but also in terms of the format and the production style, the approach we've taken to actually making them. The image on the right is me when I was making cereal, talking to a farmer called Mark Lee. And I've included that partly just as a sort of tip. It's really helpful to take photographs while you're recording, if you're recording in person especially, just so you have something to share to illustrate the episode. I think that was pretty much the only photograph that I have from the entire making of cereal. And yeah, it's something I always forget to do, but it's well worth doing. It really helps people to, yeah, I think get an idea for the people behind the audio, basically. So just a little bit more detail about Cereal. I'm just looking at the time. So yeah, Cereal was a 6-part series asking how did bread get so complicated, and profiling what we might call the UK's new grain movement. There's a bit more information there. I won't go into detail about it. If anyone has any questions, then feel free to ask afterwards. But the main thing I would say about this was it was our first attempt to tell a continuous narrative over several episodes. So unlike the monthly episodes where it's here's an interview with this person, here's another interview with this person, this was really trying to thread things together in some kind of a coherent way. And that was a real challenge. It was very enjoyable in some ways, but yeah, much more challenging to try and tell a continuous story like that. And again, I can say a bit more about that if people are interested. The next series we made was Who Feeds Us? And again, that was a 6-part series, this time exploring people's experience of the food system during COVID-19. I think at the time we thought it would be something you know, that had to be captured there and then, because of course it wasn't going to last very long. And little did we know. But yeah, really trying to gather a range of experiences from producers and also consumers or food citizens across the UK. And unlike Cereal, which was really just me with a microphone, this was a much more collaborative project. So the way we approached that is that we had 6, we refer to them as community collaborators, 1 per episode. Roughly, they did actually work on different episodes, but these were people in different parts of the UK that we recruited with a view to there being a range of ethnic backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, you know, really because the core production team, the 3 of us, you know, we are 3 white, middle-class, urban dwelling, straight people. There was no way that we would be able to capture the diversity of experiences that people had at that time. So I think that really worked very well. It meant that we came across stories suggested by these community collaborators that we never would have found otherwise. And they were then also involved with the production process, listening to edits and sort of guiding those. So that was a really interesting and I think a really worthwhile process. Definitely challenging, but yeah, really worthwhile. We also had 6 different producers, 1 for each episode, so that added another layer of complexity. But again, very enjoyable to work with a bigger range of people than we normally do. Okay, and then Landed is the series that we put out this year. It was a 4-part series, and again, this was very different. So it was a very much personal story. And through that personal story, exploring some really big themes, land ownership, colonial legacy. And this was different in the sense that it was actually proposed to us by someone from kind of outside the team, a guy called Col Gordon, who, as he describes himself, is a farmer's son. He is also a farmer and a baker and many other things besides. But he has been doing a piece of research into yeah, really the colonial connections between the small family farm and colonialism, to put it very simply. And that's what this series was exploring. So it was a collaboration in a very different way. I worked with Col to really tease out the story. And the idea was that he would be a sort of presenter, narrator. It ended up much more being a co-production. You know, he, as it happens, has a film background, was able to get up to speed with editing quite quickly. And he actually ended up taking on a lot of the editing, which hadn't been the plan. But because it was such a personal story, that ended up being necessary, actually, especially because we were working in different places, working remotely. So again, a whole different raft of challenges, but yeah, very enjoyable process and really eye-opening for me as well. Okay, try and rattle through this. So how do we make Farmerama? I think the main thing I would say is there's a lot of learning by doing. We, I think, have progressed a lot in terms of how we approach things. And a lot of that is just trial and error. You know, none of us were kind of full-time professionals when we started. We're still not. And something we've started to do more is actually taking the time to reflect on how things have gone, both during and afterwards. So actually having specific sessions where we can share our experiences and our views and how we think things could work better, which I think has been really helpful. In terms of the kit that we use, a lot of it is really basic. Some interviews are just recorded on phones, and you can get pretty decent quality just recording on a phone, either in person with somebody, or if you're recording remotely, to get them to actually record themselves on a phone instead of using the computer audio. That can sometimes give you better quality. We do now also have some fancy audio recorders, which we use. And in terms of software, we use a program called Zencastr, which allows you to record high quality audio through a computer. But to be honest, Zoom works fine as well. And then we edit on a program called Reaper, which it just so happens that's what Joe and I have chosen to use. In terms of funding, so for a long time we had no funding. It was all voluntary. There were a lot of evenings and weekends spent working on production, which I think was doable because we are all so passionate about it. It's not something I would encourage anybody to do necessarily. I think I have come to realize that it's not sustainable to be spending so much of your free time working on something. But when there's no funding, that's really how it has to be. We do now have some patchy funding from a mix of sources. So we've been able, for the series that we've done, to get grant funding from different sources. We are very lucky, largely through Abby, to have quite good relationships with specific funders, which is obviously not something to be taken for granted. We have occasionally had sponsorship from companies for the monthly episodes, which has been helpful. Something we're trying to focus on more is Patreon, which some of you might have heard of. It's a website that allows creators to be supported by the people listening or reading or, you know, consuming the content. And that's something that I think has a lot of potential. If you have a sort of loyal, engaged listenership, it's likely that people will be happy to give you a couple of quid a month to facilitate what you're doing. But it does take time and it does take energy to build that up. I put a question at the bottom there because it's one that I wonder myself, which is there a bit of a tension between the desire to be a sort of community podcast and the desire to be financially sustainable, to be able to pay yourselves? I would be curious to know what people's feeling is about that. And then also, this is something I've been wondering myself, is Farmerama a community podcast? And I've given some answers myself. yes, I think in a sense it is. A lot of the stories we cover are suggested by listeners. Sometimes they're recorded by listeners themselves. The team is very much engaged with the community that the podcast is serving. You know, it's not like we're kind of parachuting in. We are very much, involved with the work that the people who listen are doing, which I think is important. First and foremost, it is still a passion project. The funding is hugely important, but it's, you know, it's definitely not the reason that we're doing it. And increasingly, we are trying to involve a wider range of people and really hand over the reins or the microphone more. And again, happy to talk a bit more about that. On the other hand, is it a community podcast? Not really. It's quite a conventional production setup. Most of the work we do isn't what I would call participatory. The decisions are generally made by that core production team, by the three of us. So it is quite a hierarchical structure, really, with some exceptions, for example, during Who Feeds Us. And I think one of the reasons for that is that handing over the reins is a scary prospect. It's letting go of control, which I think is quite, it's easier not to do that often. And it's one of the reasons for that is that it's not always conducive to the highest quality podcasts in terms of the kind of technical quality, the creative side of it. But I don't think that should always be the priority. I think handing over the reins is well worth doing for lots of other reasons. And it's something I'm really keen to do more with Farmerama. So again, if anyone has any advice or any ideas on that front, then I'd be really grateful if you could share them. And then finally, because I think I've overshot my time, just a bit of advice from me. The first thing I would say is I do think making a podcast, especially something like Farmerama, which is never, you know, realistically, it's never going to pay our bills. It should be enjoyable for the most part. It's always going to be challenging. There will be times when it's tiring, stressful, but I think it has to be enjoyable. It has to be nourishing in some way, I think. I think it's really helpful to start simple. So, for example, with Farmrama, for a long time, all we were doing was putting a few interviews together with a bit of narration in between. And, you know, I think some of the best podcasts have a simple format like that. And it certainly makes life a lot easier than trying to tell a continuous story with lots of different speakers. I would say podcasts can be really effective for reaching a small listenership, but a very engaged listenership. You know, there are lots of very, very niche podcasts, and the goal with those is not to reach thousands and thousands of people, but it is to reach the people who are most interested. And I do think podcasts can be great for that, but you only find those people by thinking about how to promote the podcast. People need to know about it. So I think it's important to have a plan for how you're going to actually get the word out there. And then finally, despite the fact that we say award-winning in our description, it's not about the awards. There was something Joe said, which was, we're about providing a service to people who are interested in the information, rather than making the next hit podcast, which I think is important to bear in mind. Ultimately, what feels the most kind of gratifying is when people say, I really enjoyed this, or I'm going to try this out, or, you know, I've connected with this person after I heard them on the podcast. And that's the main goal. Some more information if you'd like it there, but that is it from me. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. Very, very interesting presentation.